Rightio then. Where are we up to, Teddy? Okay. I mean, of course, that this doorway is the only entrance practicable to material people. Yes, as you will see, even I discovered some other openings, secret, even had I discovered some other opening, secret or otherwise, it would not have helped at all to explain the mystery of the incredible attack in a normal fashion. For the butler, as you know, was struck in full sight of the rector, Sir Jarnock, and his son. And old Ballard himself knew that no living person had touched him. Out of the void. The rector had described the inhumanly brutal attack. Out of the void. A strange feeling it gives one, eh? And this is the evening that I had been called in to bottom. After considerable thought, I decided on a plan of action. I proposed to Sir Alfred Jarnock that I should spend a night in the chapel and keep a constant watch upon the dagger. But to this the old knight, a little wizened, nervous man, would not listen for a moment. He, at least, I felt assured, had no doubt of the reality of some dangerous supernatural force aroam at night in the chapel. He informed me that it had been his habit every evening to lock the chapel door, so that no one might foolishly or heedlessly run the risk of any peril that it might hold at night, and that he could not allow me to attempt such a thing after what had happened to the butler. I could see that Sir Alfred Jarnock was very much in earnest, and would evidently have held himself to blame had he allowed me to make the experiment and any harm come to me. So I said nothing in argument, and presently, pleading the fugitive of his years and health, he said good night and left me, having given me the impression of being a polite but rather superstitious old gentleman. That night, however, whilst I was undressing, I saw how I might achieve the thing I wished, and be able to enter the chapel. And be able to enter the chapel after dark. Where were we, Teddy? That night, however, whilst I was undressing, I saw how I might achieve the thing I wished, and be able to enter the chapel after dark, without making Sir Alfred Jarnock nervous. On the morrow, when I borrowed the key, I would take an impression and have a duplicate made. Then, with my private key, I could do just what I liked. In the morning, I carried out my idea. I borrowed the key as I wanted to take a photograph of the chancel by daylight. When I had done this, I locked up the chapel and handed the key to Sir Alfred Jarnock, having first taken an impression in soap. I had brought out the exposed plate in its slide with me, but the camera I had left exactly as it was. I wanted to take a second photograph of the chancel at night from the same position. I took the dark slide into Burton Tree, also the cake of soap with the impression. The soap I left with the local ironmonger, who was something of a locksmith, and promised to let me have my duplicate finished if I would call in 2 hours. That's really dodgy. Like, no one questions why he's got like an impression of a key in soap. Just make it for him. It's not suspicious at all. The soap I left for this I did, having in the meanwhile found out a photographer where I developed the plate and left it to dry, telling him I would call the next day. At the end of the 2 hours, I went for my key and found it ready, much to my satisfaction. Then I returned to the castle. After dinner that evening, I played billiards with young Jarnock for a couple of hours. Then I had a cup of coffee and went off to my room, telling him I was feeling awfully tired after a cup of coffee. He nodded and told me he felt the same way. I was glad, for I wanted the house to settle as soon as possible. Buddy, what are you doing? I locked the door of my room. Then from under the bed, where I had hidden them earlier in the evening, I drew out several fine pieces of plate armor, which I had removed from the armory. There was also a shirt of chainmail, which, with a sort of quilted hood of mail to go over their head. I buckled on the plate armor and found it extraordinarily uncomfortable, and overall I drew on the chainmail. I know nothing about armor, but from what I have learned since, I must have put on parts of two suits. Anyway, I felt beastly, clamped and clumsy, and unable to move my arms and legs naturally. But I knew that the thing I was thinking of doing called for some sort of protection for my body. Over the armor I pulled on my dressing gown and shoved my revolver into one of the side pockets, and my repeating flashlight into the other. What's a repeating flashlight? My dark lantern I carried in my hand. As soon as I was ready, I went out into the passage and listened. I had been some considerable time making my preparations, and I found that now the big hall and staircase were in darkness, and all the house seemed quiet. I stepped back and closed and locked my door. Then, very slowly and silently, I went downstairs to the hall and turned into the passage that led to the chapel. I reached the door and tried my key. It fitted perfectly, and a moment later I was in the chapel, with the door locked behind me, and all about me the utter dreary silence of the place, with just the faint showing... What, buddy? Buddy? What are you doing, buddy? Oi? What are you looking at? Stop doing that, it's creepy. Okay, yeah, where am I? Dreary silence? Something about dreary silence. That's all I remember. Dreary silence of the place, with just the faint showings of the outlines of the stained, leaded windows, making the darkness and lonesomeness almost the more apparent. Now it would be silly to say I did not feel queer. I felt very queer indeed. You just try, any of you, to imagine yourself standing there in the dark silence and remembering not only the legend that was attached to the place, but what had really happened to the old butler only a little while ago. I can tell you, as I stood there, I could believe that something invisible was coming toward me in the air of the chapel. Yet I had got to go through with the business, and I just took hold of my little bit of courage and set to work. Gutsy. First of all, I switched on my lantern. Then I began a careful tour of the place, examining every corner and nook. I found nothing unusual. At the chancel gate I held up my lamp and flashed the light at the dagger. It hung there, right enough above the altar, but I remember thinking of the word demure as I looked at it. However, I pushed the thought away. Demure? Why? However, I pushed the thought away, for what I was doing needed no addition of uncomfortable thoughts. Really bedtime. I completed the tour of the place with a constantly growing awareness of its utter chill and unkind desolation. An atmosphere of cold dismalness seemed to be everywhere, and the quiet was abominable. At the conclusion of my search, I walked across to where I had left my camera focused on the chancel. From the satchel that I had put beneath the tripod, I took out a dark slide and inserted it into the camera. Into the camera, drawing the shutter. After that, I uncapped the lens, pulled out my flashlight apparatus, and pressed the trigger. There was an intense, brilliant flash that made the whole of the interior of the chapel jump into sight and disappear as quickly. Then, in the light from my lantern, I inserted the shutter into the slide and removed the slide so as to have a fresh plate ready to expose at any time. After I had done this, I shut off my lantern, and sat down in one of the pews near to my camera. I cannot say what I expected to happen, but I had an extraordinary feeling, almost a conviction, that something peculiar or horrible would soon occur. It was, you know, as if I knew. An hour passed of absolute silence. The time I knew by the far-off faint chime of a clock that had been erected over the stables. I was beastly cold, for the whole place was without any kind of heating pipes or furnace, as I had noticed during my search, so that the temperature was sufficiently uncomfortable to suit my frame of mind. I felt like a kind of human periwinkle, encased in boilerplate and frozen with cold and funk. And, you know, somehow the dark about me seemed to press coldly against my face. I cannot say whether any of you have ever had the feeling, but if you have, you know, you will know just how disgustingly unnerving it is. And then, all at once, I had a horrible sense that something was moving in the place. It was not that I could hear anything, but I had a kind of intuitive knowledge that something had stirred in the darkness. Can you imagine how I felt? Can we indeed? It's quite something to do. Sit in a dark, very, very old chapel, alone at night, feeling the cold and the malevolence pressing in about you. Would you do that? I don't think I would. No, I don't think I would, for sure. Definitely not something I would do. It's a very strange story. You know, I was thinking about it earlier. There's probably no significance to it, but, you know, the fact that the dagger has Jesus Christ on it and also a pentacle. It's weird. Yeah, whatever. Why would you mix those two things? Anyway, I think we're going to leave it at that because... Okay, maybe another little bit and then we'll leave it. Okay, where am I up to? I can't even remember. Oh yeah, okay. So, can we imagine how he felt? Suddenly, my courage went out. I put up my mailed arms over my face. I wanted to protect it. I had got a sudden sickening feeling that something was hovering over me in the dark. Talk about fright! I could have shouted if I had not been afraid of the noise, and then, abruptly, I heard something. Away up the aisle, there sounded a dull clang of metal, as it might be the tread of a mailed heel upon the stone of the aisle. I sat immovable. I was frightened with all my strength to get back my courage. No, I was fighting. I was fighting with all my strength to get back my courage. I could not take my arms down from over my face, but I knew that I was getting hold of the gritty part of me again. And suddenly I made a mighty effort and lowered my arms. I held my face up in the darkness, and I tell you, I respect myself for the act, because I thought truly at that moment that I was going to die. But I think just then, by the slow revulsion of feeling which had assisted my effort, I was less sick in that instant at the thought of having to die than at the knowledge of the utter weak cowardice that had so unexpectedly shaken me all to bits for a time. Well, I think we'll leave it there. You know, right in the middle of the exciting bit. But hey, why not? Cliffhanger. Oh my god. Also, it's late, and if I don't go to bed now, I'm going to turn into a pumpkin. And not a good one. Oh, yeah, I can feel it coming on. Alright. I actually leave a large ruler bookmark in the place where we're up, so just, you know, just so I can remember where we're up to. And, hope you've enjoyed this second reading of The Thing Invisible, The Invisible Thing. It's chilling, spine-chilling, tingling. Alright, thanks for joining me. See you next time for part 3.